Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to our panel here at the Data for AI Week conference. We have a fantastic panel going on the ethical side of data usage. Now, if I've pulled you from the session with fabulous session with Yusuf Khan, please just go to the top of the screen where it says the schedule in that small text and click on the more button. You can get yourself to that panel. That being said, I'm not trying to chase you away from this fantastic panel. I do see a lot of people here. So first of all, a big welcome to our panel, and we'll have them introduce themselves, and you'll hear from them in just a moment. I'm just going to go over the quick logistics for the event, and then I'll transition this to Cassidy next after that, and thank you, and we'll get going. So just real quick, this is the Crowdcast platform. If you're first time on Crowdcast, just know that this event is for you. We love talking to each other. We're fabulous people. We love interacting, but this event is actually for you, our attendees. So we do really want you to be interactive. We want to hear from you, and we want to get your questions and feedback so that way we know that this event is meeting your needs. So below the video, you'll see a little ask a question button. If you click on that button, you'll be able to ask and pose any question. And other people can see those questions as well and may comment on your question or even upvote them if they like that question and they are also interested in answering that question. So I encourage you to put your questions in as you're thinking of them because other people might be thinking of them as well. Now, this panel, this session is 1 hour long. We're going to try to probably end about 5 minutes early. And Cassidy has got some great questions, probably about 30, 40 minutes or so of interaction there. And we will then get to your audience questions pretty much soon as well. So we will have time for your questions. When we answer your question, I'll be flagging them in the system so that they'll be time-stamped so that when you come back on the replay, you can see the answer to those questions. So if you have to drop, we would rather you stay for the whole session. But if you have to drop and you have a question, please put your question in because we will get to that question and we will answer it. And then you can come back during the replay and you will see the answer to your question. Some other things. So we will also be moderating your questions. So keep it clean, keep it appropriate. We'll be in there making sure that they are. And in the spirit of maintaining maximum interaction between our attendees and presenters, these events are held under so-called Chatham House rule, which means that anyone who comes to a session is free to use the information that they gain from the discussion, but please do not quote anybody in press unless you have their prior consent. So that is the Chatham House rule. So all live sessions are recorded. This will be recorded and will be available for a replay pretty much within 5 to 10 minutes after this session is over. And if you need any help at all, if you are experiencing any technical difficulties, you can go to our FAQ on the Data AI Conf site, and then if you have any other further questions and you can't get to the site or something, you can always email us, info@cognilytica, COGNILYTICA.com. It's right behind me right there if you have any questions. And that is all I have for you. So I'm really excited to hand this panel over to the fabulous Cassidy Kelly, who's got a great panel for you. I'm really all these are amazing, stellar presenters. So I'm going to turn my camera off, and it is now for you, Cassidy.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm Cassidy. I'm a journalist at searchenterpriseai.com under the greater Tech Target Network. So our site specializes in AI data science and its applications. But today we're here to talk about the ethical side of data usage with a bit of a government lens. So for right now, I would love to have my panelists begin to introduce themselves so you can hear more about them.
Hey, everybody. My name is Gus Walker. I'm a Senior Director of Product for Veritone. I work in the Government Legal and Compliance Business Unit.
Okay. Hi, I'm Neil Chaudhry. I am a Director for AI implementations at the AI Center of Excellence within the General Services Administration. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Happy to be here with all of you and my co-panelists. My name is Alka Patel, and I am the head of AI ethics policy at the Joint AI Center, or as we call it, the JAIC, at the Department of Defense. I'm happy to be here with all of you.
Perfect. So now we're just going to hop into some questions. Like Ron said, as we're discussing, if you'd want a specific panelist to elaborate further or you have some more questions, feel free to write them in the chat in the Ask a Question bar, and we'll get to them at the end. So to start off, I think a great place to begin is to ask my panelists what they think the biggest ethical concerns around big data, data collection, data usage, data privacy are.
Excellent question. I think I would start with who's collecting the information. Do I trust them? What are they going to use it for? Next is how are they using this information? Are they making inferences that are supported by facts? Are they sharing it? And do I have a say in this process? Those are the things that I think I've found in my communications with our customers are uppermost in their mind when it comes to AI ethics.
And I'll just share too, Cassidy. I didn't really go into this in my background, but for those of you who are tracking, earlier this year, the DoD adopted its AI ethical principles, which are responsible, equitable, traceable, reliable, and governable. And so as we think about these principles and we think about data, it goes across all these principles. And so we could talk about this for hours or days, frankly, right? But I'll just kind of highlight a couple really high level perspectives in terms of trust, as Gus was just saying. Trust, the requirement for transparency, the requirement for traceability, thinking about data integrity, thinking about use. So when you acquire and you get data for a specific use, making sure that it is allocated for that use and not necessarily secondary or tertiary uses, that it was not consented for, right? So thinking again about consent, privacy, and the social and cultural context that data brings with it. And so, as I said, we could talk about this forever, but those are just some of the high level things that come to top of mind.
So when I look or think about ethical concerns around, big data, data collection and usage, I've been in this field for a little over 20 years, starting from mainframes, and now we're back to mainframes in a cloud sort of environment. I look at how we design our solutions, and focusing on the three learning models of abduction, induction, and deduction. And you say, how are we setting up our data sets, our data collection for analysis? Because the way we set up gives us the answer that sometimes we may be looking for, or sometimes, the answer that we're not looking for. So, so in that sense, just picking the right data, having consent to use the data, and drawing the appropriate conclusions from that data are critical to usage, and the ethical usage of data. Thank you.
Great. So how would you begin to facilitate? We talked a little bit about trust. How would you begin to facilitate trust between, business employees and government industries, plus users and AI providers, people who are using AI? Where do you begin?
So go ahead.
No, please go ahead, sir.
I would say it starts with, kind of the concept we're all sort of dancing around, intent. What are we intending to do with the data that we use? And then understanding what that intent could lead to, and then building the frameworks around that so that, as we talked about, there is consent for use for intent. I think in many ways, the government needs to lead the way for these policy decisions, because while we want to rely on private business because they move very quickly, government is there to kind of give perspectives that sometimes private business may not necessarily make paramount. What is best for the communities that we're in that are going to be served by these technologies that we start to bring to the world?
Yeah, and I can piggyback a little bit off what you just said. This idea that trust, right? We're always circling back to this idea of trust, and it's trusting the company. So if it's a company that doesn't have any corporate history, it doesn't have its, the employees of that company have no known record of what they have done, it makes it very hard to trust. And trying to, reduce the administrative burdens to improving that trust is like a critical issue. There's one, it's one thing to get a private company to recommend a wrong sort of like, hey, you may like this notebook after you just bought 16 notebooks. you may like this other notebook. There's that versus what government does, and we can't get that wrong in government. So it's trust in who we're giving the data to or who we're sharing the data with, and how is it being governed, how is it being used, and how is it being secured are critical issues that go back to even, the bigger problem of what are we trying to solve. Thank you.
And I'll just add to Cassidy, just to sort of echo some of the points that have already been made. But obviously, trust is complex, right? It's not as simple as having, if you've done A, B, and C, you've got it done. You've checked it, and you've got the trust going on. I think, to some of the earlier points, in the government, our mission is critical, right? When we think about our mission is critical. And when we think about incentives, our incentive structures are very different than perhaps private industry. And so all the more reason for us to really be thinking about trust from a different perspective. If I go back to the principles for a second, I'll just sort of say, those principles are for, AI ethics principles, but obviously data is a critical component of that. And so again, how do we think about that data provenance issue, data integrity, and more importantly, how do we think about it across the entire AI product lifecycle? Right. And so when we think about design, development, deployment, and use, we have to recognize that data is not static when it comes to AI, right? It's very dynamic. And so constantly being diligent and intentional, I think Gus's point about intent is so critical, right? So being diligent, being intentional in terms of how are we collecting the data? For what purpose are we collecting it? Is it representative? Have we looked at have we identified biases? Have we thought about how we've mitigated the risks around it? And thinking about do we need to include certain assessments around those data? And what kind of data governance structures do we need to create around all of that? And so it's not just a simple answer, but you kind of have to put all these pieces together, which then allows for traceability, accountability, and frankly, transparency. And so if we're talking about trust, there needs to be transparency. And so all of these sort of foundational layers and points need to be put in place to really allow for that transparent lens to build and create that trust.
Yeah, and I would add that the capacity to provide input. A lot of the anxiety that is around AI has to do with the fact that it feels in many respects that it's being inserted upon us, applied upon us. We need to create proper forums so that we can get input from these non-technical stakeholders, because this is materially going to affect their life, right? If you trying to foster a relationship of trust with anything from team sport to business to government, I need to be able to feel that I can give input, that my input is accounted for, is respected, is integrated into the system, so that I don't feel that I'm being acted upon. I feel more that I am a coordinated partner with, and then that will help foster trust. And trust takes time. This is a new technology. This is a lot of us are still understanding how the different mechanisms work and the implications. So this will be a journey. But like e-commerce before this, and online banking and telemedicine that's coming now, as communities become more familiar with these processes, as they become more ingrained in their life, trust will be fostered and increased.
Yeah.
And
I love that. Yeah, go ahead, Neil.
No, I was going to say, just piggybacking off exactly what Alka and Gus talk about, right? It's this idea of, in government, we take privacy very seriously. So, and I know technologists want to just jump in and break things and do some cool things. And the premise here, at least what I've seen work really well, is that if you can't explain your project in plain English to your privacy subject matter experts, your ethicists, your attorneys, then maybe you're not ready maybe that project is not ready for prime time. So it's taking the mindset that, thinking through a project may not be a bad thing, that the ethicists and, the attorneys are not roadblocks, but actually enablers to get you to where you need with the least amount of pain, so that you don't have data spillage, you don't have unintended consequences by moving fast and breaking things. So thanks.
Absolutely. Yeah. As a follow-up to that, I'm really interested in hearing a bit about what everybody thinks about do you see the relationship between government-led, data ethical protections, perhaps laws, or private industries. How do you foster a positive relationship between the private sector and government agencies while also ensuring compliance and diligence and a back and forth that's positive for both the public and the private sector?
So speaking as a private sector representative, I think one of the things that's helping us on this journey is participating in these government programs like FedRAMP, et cetera. What we need to do is have appropriate timelines and roadmaps. And in order to do that, we need clear guidelines from the government. So when we can work with them in these established programs, it makes it a little bit easier for us to anticipate what types of resources we need to bring to bear, what type of questions we need to ask, et cetera, et cetera. I think the challenge will be that private industry obviously moves at a pace much faster than government. How can there be aspects of government representatives that can be in there and be in that dynamic kind of mix and tussle, so that we from the private sector can be acting under the best auspices of what we want to do for our communities, but with clear guidance. And in some cases, again, this reverts back to my last observation, input. We want to be able to give input. For the FedRAMP program, for example, that was something that was mandated and we comply with. But I think because this is a lot of greenfield space, we're going to have some information that we're going to be able to share with the government agencies that might help foster some of the decision making in a hopefully more accelerated way, which will help us hit the timelines that we have the pressure to adhere to from private sector.
Neil, you want to go from the government perspective first?
Sure, I'll try. And I was since you're the actual attorney with the here, I was going to defer to you, but I can talk from a when I talk technology, because my role is specifically in my expertise is in implementation, right? It's project management type work. So when I talk about people, process, and technology, and we talk about the difference between private and public sector. So when we're talking about public sector, we have a people debt, a process debt, and a technology debt. And what it really boils down to is, for private industry to partner, we need to have innovation, right? But we also need a on-ramp for the process debt to work itself out. And that's where, understanding, engaging with industry to showcase the value of programs like FedRAMP, our data security standards, our FISMA compliance, all those laws that go in the background, being able to not make it so jargon heavy, but make it easy for industry to apply, understand, and apply in the least, to be most cost effective. That is really the on-ramps. And it won't be a one day, all of a sudden, industry's got a great idea, they're executing, and we can turn the switch on and it comes to government. It's got to come in phases, but there's got to be like that on-ramp, where industry can move from 30 miles an hour to 60, 70, merge in to traffic and government. So not every new feature, when you look at private sector, and a lot of companies are following this model, you'll see a feature on the public side of that, on the private side of it, and on your public side, you say, hey, why don't I have that cool feature yet? And it says it's not tested. So it's about 3 months behind. But 2 years ago, it used to be 2 years behind. So now we've gotten to a point where private industry, the additional testing certifications, we've gotten to a point where we're about 3 months behind. Maybe we'll even get to closer where we're about, we get to a point where we're feature parity. For government public sector work. But that's the thing, is really being able to communicate through forums like this, the idea of how do you take the people debt, process debt, and tech debt and move it along that is palatable to private industry, that they're not making those operational investments without this idea of how they're going to recoup their investments. Thank you.
And so I'll just add, sort of thinking about the soft law versus hard law concept, as we wait for regulatory regulations to come down to really provide national-wide guidance, I suppose, in regards to some of these issues. I think it's incumbent on all of us to identify what are our sort of best practices in terms of data curation, data labeling, use of data, storage of data, security of data. And so I will say, last week, the JAIC actually hosted the DoD AI Symposium, and a lot of our focus was talking about industry-government collaboration. And so, as Gus said, just like these types of forums, or Neil also said as well, these kinds of forums and interactions are really critical because there's learnings to be had on both sides, right? And so while industry is ahead of us, perhaps in terms of tools, or research, as well as academia in regards to perhaps ways for bias detection tools and so forth, we as the government need to be able to sort of flex that muscle and get access and work together. This is a journey, right? Gus said this is totally a journey. Making sure that we get the data right is not a competitive issue, right? Like this benefits all of us, right? This is the right thing to do in terms of identifying practices and processes that are standard in terms of our approach. And I'm not talking about technical standards like ISOs, although that is, another realm in this conversation, but really thinking about how do we at least have those private public partnerships and conversations and access, because I think at the end of the day, it isn't about the government necessarily dictating. Yes, while we should be providing the guidance and the standard, it has to be done in a collaborative fashion because we also want it to be inclusive. And so thinking about, perhaps some types of organizations we would collaborate with, or like if we think about acquisition, for example, we don't want to just have requirements that perhaps only allows larger organizations who have resources to avail themselves versus being inclusive and saying, all right, maybe the smaller startups who are working in this space, we want to engage you too. And so we want to make sure that our standards align more broadly in terms of our approach. And so when we think about interoperability, I tend to think about like interoperability of not only the technology, but again on the ethics principles and our approaches and how, while we might define them for us at the government, but how do we actually make sure that's interoperable with these other sectors such as private industry?
Yeah, and I would add one more thing. One of the other things to be considerate of is the fact that the federal government is huge. You've got the Department of Justice, you've got the Department of Defense, the FDA, et cetera. They're all going to need AI tools. As a private representative of the private sector, being able to get clarity where if we solve a solution for one, it's a little bit easier to make it available to the other departments is also critical for us. This is an involved journey to meet these compliance recommendations, which is appropriate. But we are reticent, and it's difficult for us to justify the financial burden to be able to have to do this over and over again. So, and I think some of the programs like FedRAMP and other programs are addressing that. But that is one thing that can help accelerate and smooth the integration of our combined efforts.
Yeah.
That's oh, please go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
No, please.
All right, so I'll just say real quickly, and then you could probably elaborate, but I do know there is a federal data strategy that is in process, and I believe sometime later this year it should be shared out and complete. And I think, again, to Gus, to your point, I totally can appreciate where you're coming from on that. And I think, again, sort of having a level set of standards or at least expectations around data is critical as we think about it from a government-wide perspective. And then, of course, nuances will always occur, agency specific. So.
Gus had just made the point about ROI. And one of the things, that I've seen in my, 10 years in the federal space, but 20 years in public service, that, there's this misunderstanding. Sometimes folks feel that, government employees don't understand ROI. And, it's like we do understand ROI. Our ROI is just a little different. In the private sector, the ROI is about dollars, right? It's about the return on investment on the dollars put in. For us in the federal space, in the public space, it's about the improved delivery of citizen services. That's our ROI, right? Our ROI isn't measured in dollars and cents, but in terms of satisfaction of the citizenry with the services that they're receiving, as a input to the taxes that they pay. So, that's that balance. So every day when you're a federal employee, you think about, how do I improve the delivery of services to the citizens? Whether it's like, can I put more information on the website so they don't call to ask that information? How do I use plain English to solve some of these things? And now we're starting to use even advanced analytics, and we say, there are a lot of there are a lot of benefit agencies that say they're doing these human-centered design studies that start off with, what are we getting the most calls about? And what can we do to automate that process? Can we put RPAs in place? Can we put, other things in place, bots in place? How can we leverage technology so that if all you're calling about is what's my balance on my, account, or am I eligible for this benefit? You don't have to wait online to talk to a person. You can just use a chatbot, or you can use a binary RPA type tool to get the answer you need and continue working. And that frees up the government employee, whose time is their most limited asset, to help with the more complex cases, to help the people that maybe don't have an internet connection, or because of their age or something else cannot use the internet, right? That's where we want to say, instead of having them wait 15 minutes on the phone, now they're waiting 2 minutes on the phone, because we have figured out how to do this omni-channel improved delivery of citizen services. And that's where, with private sector, especially in AI and ethics, what we're trying to do is say, leverage private sector innovation in an ethical way to make sure that we are focused on delivery of improved citizen services. Thanks.
Yeah, that's great. That actually touched on one of my questions, which was, FedRAMP, CDP, and other certificates of compliance can be really great tools for, ensuring some level of data privacy and protection, and especially as a way for consumers to see that a private business has become compliant in that way. But how do businesses gauge if the investment is worth sometimes a hefty price tag? And how do they go about making it a priority?
Yeah, I can answer that. So I think it boils down to two things: risk versus reward, and then public perception. So from the risk versus reward, that's pretty standard. Are the opportunities available by partnering with the government financially viable for us? Is that something that we can invest in an ongoing basis that will help us out? There are obviously a lot of private companies that have had long-term relationships with the government in aerospace, et cetera, et cetera. But this is a new space, as we talked about, where a lot of startups or new companies can come in and get in. So how can we make sure that, and it's not an inconsiderable cost to get into the FedRAMP certification, that we can make money after that because we have a fiduciary responsibility to our investors. On the public perception, just like with the FDA approval and for consumer products, allowing us to know what clearly we can adhere to helps not only ensure that we maintain a specific standard, but helps us communicate this trust and these standards back out to the constituents, your customers, our customers, the people that we serve. And then it's also situational. If I'm building a self-driving car or autonomous drone, well, then I really want to make sure that I'm adhering to top-level certification requirements or policies. However, if I'm just doing something like you said, a recommendation engine, do I qualify for this service? Do I qualify for this grant? Then it's a little bit different. So being able to make the appropriate determinations if the risk is worth the reward, and that if we can leverage adhering to these recommendations in such a way that we can better serve our customers, that helps make better decisioning, make better decisions.
And part and parcel, we started this conversation with trust, right? And trust building exercises. And when you think about it, even in your day-to-day life, when you go to your local mechanic and, you may have that historic relationship with them, you have seen them for 20 years, they know how to fix your car. But if you just move into a new neighborhood and you don't know the mechanics, the first thing you look for is like some sort of industry certification that they actually know what know how to fix a car, right? They actually won't damage a car trying to diagnose a problem. And, FedRAMP and all these other programs are like that. It's that, process that we know that once a company has gone through that process, we have reasonable assurance that they can perform at scale, and they understand public sector, right? And that's the balance between, should I invest, should I not invest? And the question, that it's a question that in the public sector we can't answer for a private company. But what we say is, having gone through these processes, understanding what public sector means, that's really that thumbs up that gives us a little more, not knowing anything about the company. We know that this is one more thing we can use as an indicator to say, yes, this company can hopefully perform at scale because they can actually invest in certifications, right? So, and once again, every regulation that we go through, right, there's this mental thing. Is it going to be too burdensome that only a few in industry are going to be able to participate, right? And how do you expand the field for every small, new, innovative company without being burdensome? And that's the challenge. So it's not about over-regulation. It's about the right size regulation that's consistently applied and easily understandable by everybody. And that's the, what I take away with. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And this idea of tension is very important. And it sort of leads me to my last two questions as we're wrapping up the questions that I have for the panelists. First and foremost, that I've noticed, a lot of formal initiatives, ethical AI standards sound really great. But they're very broad, right? There'll be something like AI systems should empower everyone without bias. And that sounds wonderful. And I think that universally that is true. That's what people, private and public, want. But how do industries and government agencies actually turn these ethical ideas into actionable insights, actionable ideas, actions, laws? How do you go about going from broad ethical standards to things that can actually be controlled?
Excellent question. Again, I think we need to circle back to establishing the thresholds for the policies that need to be implemented. So if we take PII, personal identifiable information, for example, where is it needed to train AI models? What particular AI models? How can we do so perhaps in a way where we can train the model and then forget the PII afterwards? Because a lot of these are just working to build generalities, but they need specific information at times to build the best model. The unspoken reality about this is that this AI race is global. There are countries and jurisdictions out there that are working as fast as they can to dominate this. This is another space race, so to speak. If we want to be competitive, we need to be able to determine these things very quickly so we can get out there and we don't get bogged down in the back and forth, which is important. We need to thresh out the details, but at the same time, we need to move at the speed of business as best we can relative to the requirements and the constraints the government fields. The other thing that perhaps we need to think about is perhaps challenging our expectations of what is privacy. Now, this is a little bit controversial, but that's something to think about. In the past, the level of effort it took to track an individual's location, who they were communicating with, what their interests were, was considerable. Now with tools like Facebook and Twitter, the cookies on your browsers, your mobile device, that information is all there and it's there available at scale. So do we have, and I don't have an answer yet, the same expectations for what we can expect of my privacy now in the 21st century relative to when some of these privacy expectations and policies were written? Perhaps we look at policies like the ones in Europe, the right to be forgotten. How can I enact that, make sure that that's been executed appropriately and I can feel safe about that? Or do we realize that some algorithms are so sophisticated that I don't need to know the specific details of your life? If I know enough about your neighbor, their socioeconomic status, their interests, where their children go to school, I can infer with a high degree of specificity the same about you. So again, challenging these assumptions of PII, not to turn the conversation upside down, but maybe to broaden it so we can kind of understand where we might be trying to constrain ourselves in ways that are not necessarily in accordance with what's happening in the broader world at this point.
Yeah, great perspective, Gus, and great input for sure. And I'll just piggyback if I can off of some of that. And I'll say it. And I didn't say this in my intro, but Cassidy, the question that you asked is really my job, which is like, wow, how do we do this, right? Like, how do we actually take these DoD AI ethics principles, for example, and implement them and operationalize them? And I should also have shared a disclaimer that I am not an ethicist. My background is really technical in engineering and law. And so I come at this from a good engineering practice perspective with a risk management, governance, compliance type lens to our approach to implementation. And maybe if I can, I'll give you a specific example of some actual tactical things that we've recently done at the JAIC that speaks to some of what Gus was sharing as well. So we actually recently tested out tools of data cards and model cards. And I think for those who are in this space are probably familiar with the fact that you've got, when you ingest data, you have a data sheet or a data card, whatever document you want to call it, but it basically outlines what type of data, how representative is it, are there biases, what are the mitigants, and it gives you that picture in terms of the data set that you're getting. And so when we were doing a recent project, right at the very beginning, there was a conversation about what data is actually needed to solve this problem, right? It's not, let's get all this data, we've got all of it, let's throw it at this problem. It's no, what's the problem and what data do we need to solve that problem? And let's leave it to that scope. And sort of the next step then is, all right, now that we have data cards as data is being ingested, thinking through, all right, what are the thresholds for some of the content that's on those cards? So for example, is there PII? Do we need, should we be even receiving PII? And the answer is no. So no, so then put that data set aside, take it back. But the point there is, it's a combination, at least in my mind, the way I think about it is that it is the use of specific tools and assessment points collectively. So the data card to me is just a tool. We are asking for someone to fill it out and give it to us. And frankly, that's a whole other conversation in terms of understanding how to fill it out and the training and so forth that's associated with it. But the assessment of having, for example, and I know this has been alluded to earlier, a diverse and cross-functional group of individuals assessing what the content on that card is, right? To identify, there are some red flags, certain thresholds have been exceeded and we need to sort of go back and revisit it. And so the combination of the assessments, whether it's via a review board, whether it's via a formal data governance council, I think are sort of tangible, tactical ways in which we can try to implement sound processes around really ensuring the integrity of the data that we are getting. And the other piece I'll just kind of quickly share here is that we're not looking at the data right at the beginning and through development isn't the end of it, right? So I mentioned deployment and use. And so especially with AI, and we think about the injection of new data coming in as the model is learning and training and is out there and being deployed, we really have to be diligent and intentional about what does that ongoing data review process look like? How do we ensure that there isn't data drift occurring? How do we ensure that the performance the system is the way intended and there isn't some unintended consequence or harms to certain communities or certain impacts in mission that we don't want? And so just sort of thinking about processes. And the last point I'll make, because again, I could talk about this for a while, is, and I think this goes to Neil's point too, which is, I can share sort of tools and processes that we are trying to develop at the JAIC and think about more broadly scaling within the DoD, but it really is organizational specific, because every organization has a certain culture, every organization has resource constraint, every organization has its own sort of governance structure. And so how do you sort of build in safe spaces for these types of processes, these types of conversations, a way for individuals to say, hey, wait a second, like feel safe about raising their hand and raising issues. And so all of these things come into play. And so what might work for me may not work at another organization. And so just being mindful and thoughtful around all of that.
So, I just want to highlight something, Alka talked about, and so did Gus. about this idea of governance, right? Data governance, that it's a continual, it's not a just one-time process, it's a continual process. And, this idea that we can infer other things from larger data sets. And the example I give people is, when you have a Yelp-like platform, it makes sense to include geospatial and temporal data in that data set to do a good analysis, right? But when you have a website that says, here you can submit a complaint as a whistleblower about fraud, waste, and abuse, what's the purpose of including geospatial or temporal data in that data set except to try to identify or uncover who that whistleblower is, right? So we have to think about these things, the granularity, and this idea of least permission data sets. That's a continual process. So we might start with, giving some data, and then as the experiment or analysis evolves, we actually start cutting off access to certain sets of that data just because it's not needed anymore. And as we learn together, we figure out the negative impacts of providing that amount of data. So, from that's where it comes into, is from a government, we have to be very careful about how much data we're giving up. And the first question we always ask as part of this governance is, why do you need this? If you don't have this data set that I'm going to give you, how will that impact the efficacy of your analysis? So, and it's got to be a continuous process, unless, just to maintain public trust. Thank you.
Those are excellent points, and I would add two others. One, to the earlier point about the sharing of the information. If we take a step back and look at, and I'm not a data scientist, but I work with a lot of them, how these models are created. The models may be created outside of the federal government system. You might not have access to that training data. So all the policies and recommendations in the world about the data set may be moot because this is a model that was developed offshore, overseas, et cetera, but that has been selected for use in the government. To resolve those types of situations, the post-development analysis is the next challenge, as you mentioned. So I'm doing a shameless plug for my next session, which is right after this, for Trust in AI. Join me and I can help explain a little bit about that. But tools, both for private sector and for the government, to be able to analyze and evaluate these models, not just at the point of decision making, which one do I use, but once they're in situ, once they're deployed, you can monitor them, as we would other employees or other agencies. Let me get some feedback here. Let me track what your progress is. And whenever I see an anomaly, what is the established predefined process for digging into that to see if we actually have a problem or if it's benign?
Yeah. Great point.
All right. Well, this is we have a bunch of questions from our very active audience who are asking some really great questions. So I'm just here to pose the questions. I'm not going to step into answering all of them. I'm going to go with kind of in the order in which they were sort of rank sorted. As you know, you guys can upvote these questions. So I'm kind of going in this order. So a bunch of great questions from Jen, who has contributed a lot. And so this first question has to do with respecting privacy and laws. So it really has to do with like the relationship between privacy and privacy policies, but basically asking is like, we talk about respecting privacy with our data, but why is it that we are so far behind in regulation and regulating data privacy in terms of having laws in place that the public is fully agreed on? So I know we have some people who might be able to answer this question.
So the question to restate is, why does the public policy on private information lag behind implementation?
I think it has to do with right, and also to do with the kind of where companies, as you know, companies and individual organizations are maybe ahead of where regulation is. And of course, there's actually a second question that goes with that has to do with global regulation and kind of why we're behind. But I just want to open it up as far as like any thoughts as to the pacing of laws, maybe at the federal level, state, and of course at the local level. For example, we just saw. I think it was Portland banned facial recognition, first in the nation. We have a bunch of laws in some states that are for autonomous vehicles and some other. This is something we've been tracking at Cognitica research. Is like also, and they're not all consistent? Sorry, Gus, I have you on the screen here, but
no problem.
yeah,
I think it has to do with a couple of factors. One, in private industry, we have more of a direct relationship with our consumers, and we can put mechanisms to get their consent in front of them. Those terms and services you're always agreeing to. The little band that comes up, do you agree with that cookie? So we are much more proactive about getting consent, and it's kind of, in many ways, kind of a barrier to the relationship. If you don't give us consent, we can't really work with you. But if you do, then we can provide a lot of value. So it's intrinsic in our business model to obtain that early on. The other thing that might be challenging is that government's big. They've got a lot of things to think about. They don't necessarily have the technological specialists that can help explain to the decision makers, the congressmen, the senators, how these things work. Just anecdotally, it seems like our Senate is more septuagenarian than it is, baby boomer. The young developers now, and so there may not be as much of. They may not have the information that they need to be able to make these quick decisions. So is there a way to get them that type of information? How could they make decisions about e-commerce if they'd never even considered that, didn't know what a web server was, didn't know what the internet was? How can they make decisions about AI? They're not familiar with data sets, they're not familiar with statistical analysis, et cetera, et cetera. So I think those two things play into this. I don't know if that fully answers the question, but it's in our best interest in private industry to get consent early and to solve that. And we also then have the specialists who are domain experts on this that can help inform our internal policies. So that may be why we tend to be a little bit further ahead in terms of our thinking on some of these things.
And I'll just share too, again, like I'm not speaking for the DoD or the JAIC on this question at all, so don't hold me to it. But just from some of my prior experiences, obviously each state has its own privacy regulation, right? And so I don't think on a national scale we've been able to get consensus in terms of how we're going to do this collectively in the same way or in the same way or process. And so I think what I've noticed, at least in the last year or two, is that states are taking their own actions to take to afford citizens additional protections in terms of privacy, and not only states, but cities on the local level, right? And I think not only all these facial recognition bans, for example, but believe New York and their city council, it's sort of being now pushed down. I think because perhaps on a national level, the movement, as we know, hasn't been as fast as perhaps it should be. And I think, too, to Gus's point, there is sort of this gap in terms of how do we educate and make sure that our legislators are up to speed in terms of these issues, the impacts, the nuances. It's not easy, right? Like this privacy question isn't easy because there are so many sort of interrelated factors when you think about privacy, or excuse me, private industry incentives, their business objectives, and so forth. And so I think there's, again, a lot of sort of competing factors. And I think too, like when we think about GDPR in Europe, in terms of them being ahead, agreed. Like I think they were having this conversation well before we were, right, on a national level, no doubt. But I also think too, now, as we're thinking about AI, there are some other conversations going around in terms of is GDPR restrictive in certain senses in terms of allowing some AI applications to be actually moved forward. And so, I think, again, that balance is really hard to do. So it's not an easy question for sure, but definitely one to consider.
Yeah. There's actually a related question. You brought up GDPR a few times, and also even brought up this idea of innovation. They all kind of come together here. Well, Gus, you brought it up a little bit as well. And that has to do with GDPR. So, I'll read the comment, the question as it comes in, and I guess just answer it if you can. So, basically, Europe appears to be out ahead of data protection in particular. They've really thought through a lot of the issues of data protection issues. For example, for GDPR, and the United States leaders in AI technology and AI data technology. So the question has to do with the role of innovation. Is it of innovation is ahead of well, the way this question such as U.S. put innovation above welfare of the public sector, but also another other questions related to this about the relationship between innovation and privacy and regulation and protection. I know it's a bit of a complicated question, but maybe want to sort of jump into how do we balance these things?
I think it's an interesting observation. And one of the things we probably want to bear in mind is that there's some cultural differences, as we've talked about. Europe has had historical experiences, and we don't have to dive into them, where being able to find and identify certain populations has led to unfortunate consequences. And so it's uppermost in their mind. It's generational. It's intrinsic to the culture there. We have been fortunate in that we don't necessarily haven't until now experienced that to the same degree. And so the cultural sensitivity is not there. Also, they are working in very similar scenario to us, where they've got different states working together, but our states all work within the umbrella of the federal government. You will have very separate cultural traditions, language traditions, legal traditions that they have to homogenize. So a lot of those things, I think, got elevated early to the surface, which is why they might be more ahead of us in terms of their considerations of those things.
I know we're kind of running very close to the end time, and actually Gus has another session right after this, and I want to get him there. And Cassidy as well. We have another panel on this topic.
We do.
Sorry, Ron, it's a little bit hard to hear you.
Oh, okay. Am I
very faint?
Yeah.
Sorry, I think I had my mic mute on. Sorry. I was saying you're going to hear Gus on the panel the next session, so we only have time for one more question. But also, we have the next panel that we have here with Cassidy is on this topic as well, ethics. So some of these questions we can carry over to the one to ask to our industry representatives. We have a few of them, including one for the CEO of AI for Peace. So a whole organization focused on this. But I will ask this one question because it has a little bit to do with racial bias. Because as you know, one of the issues we're dealing with right now here, especially in the U.S. And I'll read it straight up. And there's some political overtones, but I'm just going to leave it to the panel to answer this question. So the question is: it's important that AI and ethics this is a question from Pamela. It's important that AI and ethics developments and frameworks include a participation from traditionally marginalized communities to help ensure AI bias risk is properly managed. They must align to diversity and inclusion principles and methods. But recently, as you might have heard, the Trump administration banned diversity training or reduced diversity training at federal agency level. So, I mean, how do the various government panelists here? Sorry, I didn't mean to be focused on you, Gus, because I think I just left it on there. Leave it to me. How do the government panelists here plan to include race, diversity principles, and in its ethics, AI ethics standards, policies, and procedures, and training and framework? I guess given that there may not necessarily be as much support from the top of the executive branch at the very least. So I don't know if Elka or Anil, you want to jump in on this particular question? It seems to be aimed to our government.
So
panel.
what I'll say is this is such a loaded question that a short amount of time doesn't do it justice. So I'm going to have to defer answering this question. Thank you.
Okay, so we will get Elka. I know put the pressure on you here, but
Sure, no, and I'll echo Neil's comments, but I will share. However, for the DoD, when we look at our principles, one of them is explicitly states equitable. So it requires the department to take deliberate steps to minimize unintended bias in AI capabilities, right? So it is part of our ethics principles. So I will say that is top of mind. It is part of our conversations internally as we think about the actual technology capability and how we are building it, how we are defining our frameworks, how we are defining certain practices around using bias tools, detection tools, thinking about other ways to red team, to identify, to ensure that the data is representative, and so forth. So I think I just share that with you so that you're aware, at least on the DoD side. I'm not speaking for the entire federal government, of the other aspects, but it is an explicit part of our ethics principles. And I know recently Secretary Esper has initiated a diversity campaign. And so, again, sort of top of mind for the DoD.
Okay. All right. Well, I really want to thank this panel. As mentioned, we have another panel on this topic from the industry perspective. I will be there. Cassidy will be there. I want to really, let me unfocus here. I keep forgetting to do that. I really want to give our panel a big thank you. And Cassidy, I don't know if you have any final words, but I wanted to thank all of you for being such a fabulous, fabulous panel, and the attendees being very fabulous as well.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I love being able to read the questions as we go. So if you come to the second panel, which is starting in 5 minutes, I'd love to see the attendees there. But for the panelists, thank you so much for talking to me today. I know sometimes targeted questions can be hard to answer, especially with questions that don't have a very easy answer. But I really appreciate hearing all of your perspectives on it, and I'm sure the attendees feel like the same.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all. See you at the next session. Stay engaged.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Take care.